I'm Gwen.
And I'm Wendy.
And
welcome to Farm Worker Chronicles.
Today we are bringing you the second part of a two-parter conversation we had with Mónica Ramírez in July of 2024. If you haven't heard the first part, you're missing out. We recommend listening to the previous episode before diving into this one.
That's right. And for those of you who need a refresher, Mónica Ramírez grew up in a migrant farm worker family and then settled out in Fremont, Ohio. She now runs Justice for Migrant Women, a nonprofit based out of Fremont, Ohio, which is focused on obtaining, you guessed it, justice for migrant women.
Both Justice for Migrant Women and Mónica are so incredible. In the previous episode, we spoke with her about the dynamics between local and guest workers, relationship building, recruiting tactics that are used abroad, and how gender plays a role in all of those things.
So in this episode, we continue our conversation with Mónica, and we kick it off by speaking about risk factors women in agriculture face and also the power that they hold.
Before we get too into it, we do want to give a heads up to listeners that sexual violence is discussed in this episode, but there's no specific case or instance discussed. So I think you've spoken on this in multiple ways, but I want to ask you if you can speak about vulnerabilities and the power of migrant women workers, farm workers. So the vulnerabilities in being tied to a certain employer if they're H-2A, their vulnerabilities in maybe their housing situations, and then what power do they have looking forward, right? You talked about.
Well, I mean, so in the anti-sexual violence world, we say these are risk factors. So what are the risk factors that put migrant women in harm's way, potentially, right? Housing insecurity. The first, in the H-2A context, or the guest worker context generally, whatever program it is, the reliance on employers for their housing, for transportation. Often guest workers are relying on their employers to take them to the grocery store, to allow them to practice their faith, right? I've had cases where the contractor took them to church or decided whether or not they were allowed to go to church. And so there's just all these ways in which the guest workers are relying on their recruiters and these employers just for very basic things, even the ability to communicate with their families in some cases. So those are all risk factors, right? Isolation, reliance, dependence, etc. Then for those who are not guest workers, in some cases, there are similar dynamics in which they're reliant on them for housing and for transportation. Sometimes they don't speak English, and so that becomes a risk factor because the only person that they can communicate with is the recruiter or the employer or the crew leader. And sometimes, unfortunately, that's the person who's also exploiting them economically or sexually. So language and then immigration status, whether it be because they have a visa or because they don't have what they call now regularized legal status. But, so immigration status, whether you have a visa or not, that becomes a risk factor for people. And it also is something that people hold over people's heads. I will give you a visa. I will take your visa. I will take your passport. I will send you home. So there's a myriad of risk factors that makes women and people who are migrating vulnerable to economic and sexual harm. And the power is, first of all, that, we have the honor of being able to represent these incredible individuals who say, I don't deserve this. I'm not going to take this. I don't want anyone else to experience this harm. And so all the people that we've had the chance to represent through our casework, they're here. These are heroes, truly. And they understand the risks and they come forward because they understand that if they don't, there are other people who are going to suffer this harm. Every single woman I've ever represented who's had a sexual violence case at work, when I ask them what would be justice for them, they always say, that this doesn't happen to anyone else. That is a very selfless way of thinking, especially when you've endured some of the harm that some of these people who I've served. And I've not only served women, I've represented men and children who've experienced sexual violence at work as well. And universally, they just don't want it to happen to anybody else. That's power. Like having the fortitude to make a decision, to come forward, understanding the risks, and knowing that you're coming forward, whether you win or not, that actually might save somebody else from that kind of harm. That's an incredible amount of power. And we see migrant women exhibiting that kind of selflessness over and over again, right? They want people to know their rights. They want to share them. They want your business card so they can give it to their friend or their cuñada, or, that is something that is beautiful. And that is something that I think a lot of people don't even recognize because they are not in community in the way that we are with the migrant people who in my case, who we come from and who we serve. I think the other power of migrant women, I saw it in action in Washington, D.C. We actually took a delegation of women who worked across industries. So some of them were restaurant workers, farm workers, someone worked in dairy, etc. And one of the superpowers I think migrant women have is their ability to quickly create community and to quickly band together. It's amazing. So this group of women who we took to DC, I think there were like 15 of them. They didn't all know each other. Some of them had just met. And by the end of the second day that we were together, we were actually in a meeting at the Department of Labor. We were meeting with the Women's Bureau and OSHA. And at a certain point in the meeting, none of us who were in the room as advocates were even in charge. Like they basically told us to sit down and be quiet, and they took over the room. And essentially they were saying to the federal government, like, what are you going to do for us? And in particular, there was one woman who's unfortunately her husband had passed away during COVID from cancer, and it's a very sad situation. But everyone rallied around her. So in that short amount of time, they created community, they banded together, and they all rallied around her. And they were demanding from the federal government to know what they were going to do to help her. That's amazing.
I just got goosebumps.
It's amazing. So I would say that's another power. I think our ability to be loving and open, right? I think that many of the migrant women who we serve are Latina. And I think culturally, as a community, that we are a very open and loving community. And I think that's something that's really special. That's a superpower. So these migrant women who we serve, they really are moving in the world with their hearts. And that might mean that they're demonstrating that by giving you a cold bottle of water or giving you some of the frijoles that they just made or making sure that everyone at the camp is being fed or what have you. That is care that they are exhibiting. And imagine exhibiting that kind of care when you've worked all day under terrible conditions, being mistreated by people, not being sure whether or not you're going to get paid at the end of the week, and still finding it in yourself to be able to say, I'm going to take care of you because I see you and I love you as a person. That is power.
Absolutely.
One of the things I wanted you to share is some of your advocacy work that has been informed by your work with women and the narrative change. And you mentioned when you educate the community about their rights and there being statutes of limitations and sometimes those statutes of limitations are so short and that doesn't give anybody enough time to process some of the trauma they've experienced, right? So what is some work that you are doing in changing policy to allow people to have that space and time to be able to process, but then also to seek legal help?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really, really important point because, I always say, like, first of all, imagine all the hurdles. Like, first you have to know that you have rights. Then you have to be able to recognize that your rights have been violated. Then you have to know what to do about your rights that have been violated, like who can actually help you. Like, there's so many things that you have to do. And by by the time you figure all that out, like the 6 months that you had, or the 1 year that you had to be able to figure it out and bring a lawsuit, like that's like long gone. Yeah. And that isn't even taking into consideration the trauma, right? Yeah. So there has been work done. Like, for example, there's this really insignificant case in Oregon that involved farm worker woman who was a survivor of sexual violence. And that was actually a part of the litigation, was that the statute of limitations had run by the time she brought her claim. There was another person who actually, her claim, from what I can remember, I think her claim was piggybacked onto the other person's claim. So someone came forward during the statute of limitations, and then that person's claim had run. So they tried to piggyback her claim onto the person who was still within the statute of limitations. And there ended up being an opinion written about it, because basically the judge came forward in the opinion, said that because of the violence against her and the trauma that she had experienced, there was no way that she would have been able to come forward in that time frame that was given to her. And so they actually prevailed in that case. But I think that is the kind of work that we have to do, is the education around, first of all, for lawyers. As lawyers, we don't get trained on things like trauma. We should be trained in law school about trauma, but we aren't. So people are not even thinking about those kinds of things. So I feel like there has to be more education to the bar on trauma. We have to do more work to get experts to come forward who can explain trauma and brain science and things like that. That's work that has to be done. But in terms of advocacy, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking to the agencies like the EEOC and others about why people can't come forward. What are some of these vulnerabilities? What is the impact of trauma? And have done a lot of work to try to educate around some of those issues. When I started my work over 20 years ago, there was the farm worker movement and lawyers who were doing work in the farm worker community. There was the kind of employment, labor rights movement, and then there was the anti-sexual violence movement. And when I started my work, none of these people were talking to each other about how to address this one issue. So that's been a part of the advocacy too, is even within the, how do we get the anti-sexual violence movement to understand the issue of workplace sexual violence and the trauma that happens related to it, so they can be supports, they could potentially be witnesses in cases, they can work with some of these agencies to help the EEOC, the Department of Labor, and others understand this work. That's been a body of work, right? And then vice versa, getting the farm worker community to understand, advocacy community to understand it, and the labor community. We have to do that work amongst ourselves and across our movements, because that is key to them being able to move the Department of Labor and the EEOC. And so it's just been a whole lot of talking and a whole lot of training and a whole lot of pushing over lots of years. But I actually do think people are finally getting it. And I think that they are using language that shows that they're more sensitive to issues related to trauma and healing. And I think the way that we're going to actually get there is through some of the case law.
We asked Mónica what Justice for Migrant Women was focusing on in July of 2024, and she told us 3 things. First, mental health access. Second, Convention 190. And third, humanitarian aid.
Oh my gosh. We are this little mighty team, and we have so many things that we're working on. So one of the big issues that we're working on is mental health. So during the pandemic, when we were doing these listening sessions with farm workers in collaboration with the National Seasonal Migrant Head Start Association, one of the issues that kept coming up was mental health. The people were feeling anxious, they were depressed. I mean, during COVID, everyone was so scared. And so that issue came up over and over again. And that led to the creation of something that we call Healing Voices, which was a pilot project that we created to provide mental health services to farm worker community members in a group care setting. And at the time was via Zoom because of COVID. So we piloted that project in California and Florida, up to 3 curricula to go alongside that project. And the therapists who were involved and the advisory board that was involved, they were all people who come from the farm worker community. So it was a very incredible group of folks who understood the lived experience of the farm workers. So we studied that project. We piloted it. We spent about 1.5 years studying it. Loyola Chicago actually studied the project to determine whether or not it was effective. And then we started working on a report related to mental health. And the reason we did all of those things is because ultimately what we hope to see is a rule change. So we had been working to get the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to recognize mental health as an occupational safety and health issue. Just like if you were to cut your arm at work, if you were to experience, mental harm at work, it should be covered. And we need to get a rule change made for that to happen. Because if we can get a rule change made for that to happen, then we might be able to get other agencies to unlock other resources. Because the way mental health works in our country right now, if you want to get therapy, basically therapy is only for the elite. Mm-hmm. Because there isn't money, really. And there are some community health services that provide mental health, but it's very difficult to get those appointments. So basically right now, because a lot of therapists do not accept insurance, you have to be able to afford $100 or $150 therapist appointment to be able to get therapy. That is out of reach for people who earn $10,000 to $12,000 a year. So we need that rule change to happen at OSHA to then be able to unlock other kinds of supports. And so that's what we've been working on. And a few months ago, OSHA finally named mental health as an occupational health and safety issue. They also named sexual harassment as an occupational health and safety issue. Those are two things that we've been pushing for. And they said that the reason that they have done some of the work internally at OSHA and taken the position they've taken, it's been informed by our work. So that's a major body of work for us, and I'm really proud of it and really proud of the team. And that delegation that we took in last September, and we met with OSHA, those women were directly responsible for this change that we have seen. So it's incredible. That's a big initiative that our new report's coming out in July because it's BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month. And the other thing that happened as a result of that advocacy is that a bill was introduced in Congress to provide resources to farm workers to get mental health support. And it now looks like that bill is going to become part of the Farm Bill and actually has a chance of becoming law. So we're really focused on that, both getting the report out into the world and trying to make sure that there's more aid that could come through some of these other agencies to be able to get resources to people to be able to get therapy. And then related to that, getting this bill done. So that's one body of work. The other major piece of work that we're doing is around something called Convention 190. Convention 190 is it is the first international treaty that extends protections to people in order to address gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. And we as a country have not ratified Convention 190. Over 44 countries have, but we have not. And I'm not sure that that's ever going to happen in the United States. But we had an event at the United Nations in April to bring people together from countries that have ratified and countries like ours that have not, to figure out what we could learn from one another and to figure out how we in the United States could apply the framework of Convention 190 in the U.S. short of ratification. And the reason this is important is because it is now the 5-year anniversary of Convention 190. So that is a huge part of the work that we're doing right now. It is really a narrative challenge because in the United States, people don't know what the world of work is. They don't know the concepts under Convention 190. And so we have a whole lot of work to do to really bring that language into kind of everyday language that working people use. And then also to rally the support of other advocates and unions, etc., so that even if the United States never ratifies Convention 190, we can at least adopt the framework and then apply it across businesses. And part of that work then means that we're going to be working cross borders. So we're now looking at doing work in Latin America. I'll actually be heading to Africa a few times in the fall because we have a lot to learn from people around the world. And so we're taking that on and figuring out kind of what's our role in that work as an organization. And then I guess the third thing I would lift up is just our continuing humanitarian aid. During COVID, we started a fund with the goal of raising $10,000 to provide resources to the farm worker community. I was an outreach worker with ABLE, and years ago, I remember as an outreach worker that there were times when we would have to get money when people would pass away, and we'd have to get money to help repatriate them to their countries. When the world shut down because of COVID, I thought we were going to need money to be able to repatriate people who passed away from COVID, which of course we did end up needing that. But that was why we created that fund in the first place. So it was $10,000. That was the initial goal. And now, several years later, we've been able to secure aid, money and other kinds of aid, and have been able to distribute over $10 million in aid, through the help of our partner organizations and others. So we've been able to work with, I think, over 200 partner organizations in 35 states in Puerto Rico to get aid out to the community. So that is continuing.
I mean, you're doing this work and creating these great projects and doing this wonderful narrative-based advocacy that is getting into people's hearts. But then you're up against some of the causes that you're fighting for and or striving for. It just seems so like it's not going to happen anytime soon. Who knows if it will happen? How do you keep your head up?
People ask me this question all the time because, my career has been focused on addressing sexual violence, which is one of the most heartbreaking things to work on. And, I've done it for a really long time. And it's one of those things that really changes you. And I always say, the only way you can stay in this work is you just have to look forward, right? You have to believe that what you're doing every day is making a difference, and that there's the possibility of change in the future, and you have to understand that it isn't necessarily going to be you who makes the change. Maybe we're setting up the conditions for change that aren't going to actually be fulfilled for another 20 years. And that has to be enough. And I think that's how you stay in it. You just have to understand that everything you're doing every day is adding up to big change that's coming.
So what can our listeners do to support Justice for Migrant Women?
Well, I think that the best thing that listeners can do to support Justice for Migrant Women is to get active and involved wherever you are. So, we as an organization are really fortunate to have sibling organizations around the country who are doing really, really good work in community. And the best way you can help us is to help them, because we need everybody pitching in wherever they are. And certainly you can go on our website, justice4women.org, and read about our work, learn about our work. But I think that in this particular moment in our country's history, where there is such staunch polarization, we need people to be champions for migrant people. We need people to help uplift the stories and contributions and power of migrant people, because we have a major narrative battle right now. There is a lot of falsehoods that are being told about migrants and immigrants in our nation. We have to create our own sort of narrative army, and everyday people are going to help carry that work, and you're going to do it by talking about the important and wonderful work that migrant people do in the fields and other places, by sharing with your siblings, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors, people you go to church with. That is the work. That is the work of the moment, and that is the work that we need everyone to really lean into.
Well, thank you, Monica.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Farmworker Chronicles.
And a big thank you to our guest for the last 2 episodes, Mónica Ramírez.
We are your hosts and producers, Wendy and Gwen.
Our executive producer is Chris Pfeiffer.
If you want to join the conversation, go to wgte.org/FWC.
Until then, I'm Wendy.
And I'm Gwen, reminding you to thank a farm worker.
Adios.
Adios.
WGTE. Voices around us.
WGTE is supported in part by the American Rescue Plan Act funds allocated by the City of Toledo and the Lucas County Commissioners and administered by the Arts Commission.